From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinion featured in JAMA.
I'm Dr. Gregory Curfman, the executive editor of JAMA, and in this JAMA author interview, I'll be speaking with Professor Holly Fernandez Lynch. Professor Fernandez Lynch is a member of the faculty of the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. Along with her co-author, Dr. Erin Kesselheim, she has written a Viewpoint article now available online at jamanetwork.com, which is titled FDA in the Crosshairs, Science, Politics, and Abortion. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Fernandez Lynch.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
We're going to be discussing a very important legal case that is now being reviewed by the Supreme Court, referred to as FDA versus Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. And this case will decide the status of the drug Mifepristone for medication abortion. To get us started, I wonder if you could take our listeners through the basic facts of this legal case and how it arrived at the Supreme Court.
Sure. This is a complex case procedurally. It's wound its way through the federal courts twice. I won't go into all of the details, but let me just tell you a little bit about Mifepristone, how it was approved by FDA in the first instance, and what's being challenged in this litigation. So Mifepristone is one of a two-drug regimen that is now used in more than half of all U.S. abortions. And it has been FDA approved for nearly a quarter century. It was first approved in 2000 after extremely diligent and careful review of an extensive database regarding the safety and effectiveness of this drug. And in fact, it took FDA about 4 years to review all of the data back in 2000 when the drug first came on the market. Now, FDA had at that time added some criteria, some additional restrictions to assure safe use of the product, including restrictions around how the drug could be dispensed, requiring in-person dispensation over 3 separate doctor visits, and also restricting the drug to be used only up to 7 weeks gestation, which is only a few weeks after a woman might even have missed her period. So a very short window of time in which the drug could be available. It's not clear that those safety restrictions were even scientifically necessary at the time, right? This was a politically fraught decision. And so FDA was trying to be quite careful in this approval. Over the course of the next several years, additional data were gathered about the drug, and FDA ultimately decided that it could peel back some of those restrictions. So starting in 2016, after additional data had been gathered since the initial approval, FDA determined that it could loosen some of the safety restrictions around Mifepristone. It extended the period in which the drug could be dispensed to 10 weeks of gestation rather than only 7. It lessened some administrative burdens on prescribers. And most importantly, FDA got rid of the requirement that the drug be taken in person in a doctor's office and allowed it to be dispensed by mail, to be taken at home. This was obviously important during the pandemic, but it's become increasingly important as we see states banning abortion. So if you can get Mifepristone through the mail, this can help ensure national access to the drug. At this point, Mifepristone is one of the most studied drugs of all time. Very clearly safe and effective. In fact, safer than other drugs that we commonly view as quite safe, Tylenol, for example. So that gets us up till 2022 when this lawsuit was first filed. The lawsuit was brought by an organization called Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which is a group of physicians who are opposed to abortion. And they brought suit in federal court against FDA, arguing that its initial approval of Mifepristone in 2000 was improper, and that the subsequent peeling back of those safeguards starting in 2016 was also improper. So they were arguing that the drug is unsafe and that FDA erred in approving it. Normally, I wouldn't bore you with these procedural details about whether this organization has standing to sue, but that turns out to be a major issue in this case, and it's one of the issues that the Supreme Court is going to opine on. Ordinarily, to have standing to sue, you have to demonstrate that you have personally suffered an injury or will imminently suffer an injury. But these are physicians who don't prescribe mifepristone. They don't use mifepristone. And so the question is, where's their injury? Their claim is that their practices may be burdened by having to care for patients who experience mifepristone complications. The reason that that argument for standing is so concerning is that if the courts accept it, it would create a scenario in which many more people who are not truly facing direct injury would be able to sue FDA and question its approval decisions, creating just tremendous instability in the pharmaceutical market. So that's kind of happening on the procedural level of this case. The key thing to know is that the Northern District of Texas agreed with Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine that FDA erred in granting approval to mifepristone back in 2000 and also in dialing back these restrictions. If that decision were allowed to stand, then mifepristone would be an unapproved drug, despite the fact that it had been on the market for nearly a quarter century. There were some emergency appeals to the Fifth Circuit, to the Supreme Court, staying that decision so that the appeals courts could decide the case on the merits. The Fifth Circuit determined that the challenge to FDA's initial approval of mifepristone was not timely. It was too late to raise that challenge. But the Fifth Circuit determined that FDA should not have reeled back those restrictions on the drug. And so where things stand right now is that the Supreme Court has to make a decision about whether and how mifepristone access will be restricted. Do we go back to the pre-2016 restrictions, the 7-week gestational limit, the in-person prescribing requirement, and getting rid of this telehealth and mail option? That is the key issue before the Supreme Court right now, in addition to this question about standing, which, as I mentioned, could be really problematic for the stability of FDA's drug approval decisions.
An important element of this case that you discuss in your Viewpoint article is that the FDA is an agency that sometimes struggles with the tension between scientific judgments on the one hand and political considerations on the other. And I wonder if you could please address the matter of science versus politics at the FDA in the context of the mifepristone case.
Now, we became accustomed to hearing during the COVID pandemic that FDA should just follow the science. And of course, it's a scientific agency. It's a public health agency. All of its decisions need to be rooted in science. FDA reviewers are evaluating clinical trial and other types of data related to the safety and effectiveness of the products that are seeking approval. However, science cannot answer all of the questions that FDA has to decide. So, is the drug safe enough? Is it effective enough? Are those risks and benefits adequately balanced? How much uncertainty is acceptable? Those are all judgments about which reasonable people can disagree. There are questions that are rooted in science, but science doesn't necessarily tell us the answer. In that way, FDA is a political agency. It is making policy-based decisions about how much risk to accept, about how much uncertainty to accept. The key, though, is for the agency never to veer too far away from the science, and certainly never to contradict the science. So if we go back to 2000 and mifepristone's initial approval, you might argue that FDA went too far in the safeguards that it adopted for restrictions to assure safe use because it was so worried about the political concerns around the drug. What I'm suggesting here is maybe some of those restrictions were not necessary from a scientific perspective. And the challenge that the agency is now facing is that leads some credence to the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine's claims today that FDA removed those safeguards on political grounds, not scientific grounds. If you are willing to be swayed by the politics on the front end, maybe you're also swayed by the politics now. So what does that mean for the mifepristone case? It is appropriate for courts to examine whether FDA's reasons were guided by science or whether they are political reasons. But it is not appropriate for courts to substitute their own judgment on the science. That is FDA's domain to make those scientific judgments. FDA has the expertise to evaluate the data, that is not something that judges have the training and expertise to do. So here, right, FDA made an appropriate scientific decision about peeling back these restrictions on mifepristone. And in fact, the law requires FDA to only impose the least possible restrictions on any drug, considering patient access and availability. So in this case, it's concerning that we had a string of federal judges substituting their judgment on the science for FDA, and that will set quite dangerous precedent if the Supreme Court follows suit with what's happened in the courts below.
Another important implication of the mifepristone case relates to a two-pronged attack, one focused on administrative agencies writ large, and the other directed squarely at the FDA. Could you please discuss how the administrative state is now under scrutiny by the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, and how the FDA specifically is being scrutinized in this case?
We can start here by thinking about different political visions of what the government is supposed to do. So some of us view the government, and the federal government in particular, as playing a critical role in protecting the health and welfare of the American public. And some of us think that the government, especially the federal government, has too much power and is too involved and needs to be kind of tamped down. So what we see across the board in terms of federal judicial philosophy is more concerned with federal government power, kind of seeking to reduce government interference and intrusion on the lives of the American public, on American businesses, and that type of thing. So one of the most substantial and active part of the federal government is agencies. And that's why they are in danger right now as we see how the courts are making decisions about agency authority. The reason this is really concerning has to do with institutional capacity and expertise. Congress is a generalist body, right? If you think about the types of people who are serving in Congress and the number of issues that they have to evaluate and make policy about, they couldn't possibly get into the weeds on all of those issues. Agencies are not generalists. They were designed to be expert in specific domains. FDA has public health expertise. It has the expertise needed to design and execute a comprehensive drug regulatory system. And we can see this kind of symbiotic relationship between Congress and the agencies. Congress creates these broad statutes, and then the agencies apply their expertise to execute that statutory authority. That symbiotic relationship is being challenged by the federal courts right now. That's happening in a couple of different ways. For several decades, the courts have followed a precedent called Chevron deference, or the Chevron doctrine. And this is doctrine that recognizes and respects agency expertise. And what it says to courts is where there is an ambiguous statute, the courts should defer to reasonable agency interpretations of that statute. Right? The agencies are experts, more experts than the courts, more experts in many instances than Congress. Chevron deference is currently being challenged in a pair of cases before the Supreme Court in this very same term as the Mifepristone case. A related challenge in the federal courts has to do with the major questions doctrine. And this basically says that on major questions, things that have vast economic and political significance, Congress must speak with a clear voice in giving explicit authority to agencies to regulate on those issues. Why is this relevant to FDA? Well, FDA is a federal agency, and if the courts are no longer deferring to FDA's expertise, it will inhibit FDA's ability to do its job. And we will see instability in the system, lack of predictability, and we will see more frequently judges substituting their views for that of an expert agency. So we have this attack on agencies writ large. We also have this attack on FDA, trying to weaken the agency over time. And now industry finds itself in a unique position of having attacked the agency for a long time, but now recognizing that if the courts also weaken the agency, that will be bad for business because industry needs the stability of agency rulemaking. So it's a very precarious time for FDA as an administrative agency, and what the Supreme Court does in the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine case will be important for the future of how much respect the agency has and whether it is able to regulate as Congress had intended when the agency was created.
Finally, I'd like to ask you about the important implication regarding the conflict between the state and federal governments with respect to mifepristone. While the Supreme Court in the Dobbs case returned the regulation of abortion to the individual states, the FDA, as a federal agency, regulates mifepristone. So how will this state-federal conflict be resolved?
It's one of the most critical questions having to do with abortion right now. I want to be really clear that this preemption issue related to federal-state conflict is not at the heart of the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine case, but there are other preemption cases around mifepristone working their way through the courts. And so this is important context for the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine case. The key question here is whether you view abortion as medical care, as I do, as many do, or as something separate, just like kind of pure social issue. FDA has been given the sole authority to regulate drugs nationwide. To the extent that mifepristone is a drug for medical care, then it falls appropriately within FDA's authority. It gets evaluated for safety and effectiveness, just like any other medical treatment. It's under the agency's jurisdiction. And when FDA grants approval, it creates market access across the entire country. States cannot say, you are not allowed to sell your FDA-approved drug within our borders. That's what I mean when I was talking about federal preemption. FDA approval preempts state attempts to restrict FDA-regulated products. You mentioned in your question that in the Dobbs case, there was discussion about returning the matter of abortion to elected representatives. Well, what does that mean, right? FDA is not an elected representative. Often when we talk about the Dobbs case, we refer to it as saying the Supreme Court said this is going to be a state issue now. Really what they said was that this is something that should be determined by elected officials and not by the court. We have to remember that Congress, a group of elected officials, gave FDA this exclusive authority over pharmaceutical products. They did not have a carve-out in FDA's authority for abortion medicines. They didn't say that FDA needs to apply different standards to abortion drugs. To the extent that abortion is medical care and that medication abortion is a drug just like any other within FDA's authority, that is something that elected officials decided. And of course, we shouldn't have carve-outs on FDA's authority for politically controversial interventions. But this is something that is being litigated right now where states are saying, we want to ban abortion within our borders. And if FDA has a drug that's available nationwide, that's going to infringe on our ability to kind of regulate these social and moral issues in our jurisdiction. If those cases are allowed to proceed, we will find ourselves in a very precarious scenario where not all Americans will have the same rights to access FDA-approved medication.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Fernandez Lynch, for your insightful discussion of the implications of this important Supreme Court case on mifepristone. This JAMA author interview was produced by Shelley Steffens. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. I'm Dr. Gregory Curfman. Thank you for listening, and thank you so much again, Professor Fernandez Lynch, for your very thoughtful discussion of this case.
Thank you.